Thank you so much to Ed for creating this challenge for us. So let's take a look at the data that we're working with. So we have a list of students and what classes they are taking and which classes they have dropped. So let's take a look at this data. So what we're wanting to do, we can see there's definitely some errors here with the spelling of certain classes. For example, if I see this science here, there's a W where there should be an E, physical education there, spelled very interestingly. So we're definitely going to need to clean up this data. And the easiest way to do that is if we have all of these subjects in one field of data. So we only have to clean up that data once rather than for each of those separate columns. So the way that we're going to do that is with a pivot step. I'm going to do a little branch from this workflow, configure it as I go along to show you how we solve this. So what we want to do is we want to turn those columns of data that contain all those different subjects into rows of data. So columns to rows pivot is the default, and that's what we want to leave it on. And the way that we can pick up all of these different fields that contain the word class is I like to use a wildcard search for our pivot. So I click on that option and just type in the word class into this pivot 1 values box, hit the enter key, and then I get all of those fields that contain the word class into my pivot 1 values section. And so that means that now I have 3 fields. I have pivot 1 names, which is the old headers of those columns, and I have pivot 1 values. So I have all of those subjects in that field, and I have our names of our students there on the right still. So I'm just going to rename this pivot 1 values field to be subject before moving on with this. Now you'll notice we have quite a lot of nulls here, and these nulls are associated only with the dropped class fields. So if a student hasn't dropped a class or multiple classes, then they will have nulls in those values, so we're perfectly safe to filter out that. We're not going to lose any information. All that we'll lose is those null values, where it's basically telling us that there isn't any data there anyway. So let's add in a clean step and do that filtering. So I'll just click on those null values and I will say exclude on the top row here. Okay, lovely. Now let's go ahead. I'm adding a new clean step because I like to do just one change per clean step. Also, grouping things logically together. So here you can see I'm just filtering out those nulls. In this step, I'm going to group together those subjects. So I'm just not renaming the steps here because I've already renamed them. But if I was going to, I could just double click on that clean 3 and type in my rename. But I'm sure that would be boring to watch, so I won't do that. So for our subject, we're going to group those values together. If I go to the menu of this field and pick the group values option here, then I think that spelling is going to work the most effectively. Because if I look at the first option there in our subject values, then I've got AATH, which I know is supposed to be math or maths. So I think that spelling is going to link that up quite closely. It's not really a pronunciation thing, and then common characters won't work here either because we don't even have the letter M in this spelling, for example. So let's try spelling, see how it works. And okay, that's looking pretty cleaned up to me. So if I click on English, for example, I can just have a quick scroll through all those different variations of English that is being included. That all looks like they should be English as a subject, so that looks good. And I could do a visual check for all of these. If this were real data, I definitely would want to be super sure as to which ones were matching up with which. But for this challenge's purposes, a quick glance over is probably good enough just to see that it's working how we'd expect it to. And that is looking generally pretty good. So I'm going to hit done and say that I'm happy with those 7 subjects that are coming through. Next up, we want to make a field which tells us of these subjects for these students which ones are dropped and which ones are active. So basically anything that has dropped over here, these are all the dropped subjects and these are all the active ones. So I could do some grouping together, which is not how I did it before. I did it as a calculated field. So let's write a calculated field. I think that I would feel that would be the slightly quicker way than manually changing each of those entries. So we will call this dropped/active And we will say if our pivot one names field contains, so we write the contains first and then pivot one names, we're looking for that dropped, so I'm just going to write the word drop there. If it contains dropped, then that field should now be classified as dropouts, and otherwise they should be active. So why am I using double quotes some places and single quotes others? Don't know. Either way is fine. I just kind of tend to do whatever I'm nearest to on the keyboard, in all honesty. So I'll just save that. And now we've got our active and dropouts field, and I can get rid of this pivot one names field. This is no longer necessary, so I'll just right click on that field and say remove. And now we're going to pivot our data again. So what we want basically is for each subject, we want to know how many students are active and how many students are dropouts. So we can make this change happen using a pivot step. So let's bring in another pivot step. We're going to this time change it from columns to rows to columns. And we want our new column headers to be active and dropouts, so 2 new columns. And then we want to count up the names of the students that appear in those columns. So let's bring our dropped/active into the top half there, and that will create for us 2 new fields, but you'll see this error appearing. We want to know how we should aggregate our other field, so let's pick up the name field and then drag it down to the bottom section, and it comes through as a count, which if we read the challenge, that's how we want to count up these students. And we have our subject now, the number of dropouts and the number of active students in there. So cool, we're nearly there with this challenge. We've done most of the tricky stuff. Now we just want to work out the total. So we want to know the total number of students. I'm just going to call this total. I think it was total enrolled in the actual challenge. And we can just add together the number of active and dropout students. Perfect. And then finally, one last calculation to do is our dropout rate. So we'll just add in a field for the dropout rate, and we'll do the dropouts divided by the total number of students. And there we have it. That's all we need to do for this challenge. So thank you very much to Ed for this challenge. It was very good to play around with different reshaping of that data and some cleaning exercises, and I hope that you enjoyed watching.